Hello Cave Dwellers, welcome to the Cave. It's really nice to be bringing you a new Trash to Treasure series. Now all that DIY business is out the way, we can really get stuck into a project. And Mark Fixes Stuff joins us. Hello Mark.
Hello, it's one of your 5 a day, Neil.
Yes, very fittingly, real English apples.
Oh.
Because this is our first ever Apple II to appear on the channel. And it's a special one. It's an Apple IIe. We'll learn what the E means and all the history of this machine. But let's just look at the condition of it first of all. If we zoom in and have a look at what's on the table here, it's absolutely filthy, so this definitely needs a clean, and you should always wash your apple before you take a bite into it, Mark.
Yep.
And it comes with a couple of paddles, perhaps for a game of breakout. No idea if these are working or not. Right. That's all going to be part of the series. I can tell you that the computer is given to us in a non-working condition.
Oh, joy.
There's absolutely no life coming out of it whatsoever, so we need to investigate that. 2 disk drives. So the Apple II originally didn't come with any kind of disk drive interface card. The IIe did, as we'll learn. So we've clearly got the card and we've got a couple of disk drives. Again, condition completely unknown. So we'll have to strip them down and get to find out what kind of condition they're in. So the goal of this series is to restore it back to as close to as good as new condition as we can.
Yep.
We'll have this thing gleaming by the end of it. Fingers crossed. There's just one other thing that I want to show you, which was in this box, and we will look at all the other things in this box.
Okay.
But I just thought this was quite insightful. So the person who donated this to the Cave was a chap called Philip McAllister. Thank you so much, Philip, for sending this in. And in fact, he dropped it off. He didn't post it in. It was far too delicate to post in. And we can see in 1991, he was no stranger to video games and computers, because on this Electronics Arts registration card for Populous, he owned a Sega Mega Drive, a Sinclair ZX Spectrum, a Nintendo Game Boy, and he claims he played video games for 6 to 10 hours per week. I think he's telling Porky Pies there. I think that was probably 20 plus hours. But
At least.
So on top of his Apple II, he had all of those systems.
That's quite a serious investment in tech.
It is.
Back then.
And there's a little clue as to what he used to do on this. So he told me that his father used to do a lot of Pascal programming on here.
Okay.
But there's also a sticker on here which is to do with a game. He couldn't remember the name of the game. And I'm undecided as to whether we should remove that. That's part of the patina of the machine and the history of the machine, isn't it? Can we clean around it? Should we protect that? Or should we just rip it off?
Just rip it off.
I'm still undecided. We'll cross that bridge when we get to cleaning it. But first of all, we need to get to the bottom of not only why is this not working, but also the history of it. Where does this sit in the Apple II range? Why does it exist? And perhaps what are some of the regional differences here in Europe compared to the ones that came out in the US?
Yeah.
Let's start with the history and then we'll get to the repair. And before we do, we'd like to thank PCBWay.com for supporting our episode today. They aren't just about PCBs, although they do a tremendous job of that. They also offer CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, 3D printing and injection molding. If you're creating, then PCBWay.com can help you bring your project to life. Get an instant quote now over at PCBWay.com, and we thank them for their support. The Apple IIe is the 3rd official model of the range of computers created by Steve Wozniak, or Woz, which began in 1977 with that original Apple II. Production of the Apple II models ran from 1977 through to 1993, a whopping 16 years, with an estimated sales of up to 6 million units across the range. This is not the obscure British flop we so often see on the channel. It's a machine that likely needs very little introduction, especially if you're in the US.
In 1976, when Woz and I designed the Apple II, what we tried to do was use the state-of-the-art technology available to us at that time to create a product that had a greater value for a computer than had ever before been realized. And I think we achieved that, because Apple II went on to be the largest selling computer in the history of the world, and still is.
The original Apple II packed a 6502 CPU running at a little over 1 MHz, 4K of RAM, and it could load from cassette through an audio interface. It had a basic programming language in ROM, and it offered a 40-column, 24-line display with characters in uppercase only. Out of the box, the Apple II could output a colour display, making it the first pre-assembled colour home computer, but it did so by manipulating the NTSC colour system, so this didn't translate to other regions around the world. Here in the UK, for example, where PAL is our standard, the Apple II would have only offered monochrome video output out of the box. but I hope to put this to the test later. The beautiful thing about the Apple II was that it was designed to be upgraded and repaired. There aren't even any screws to hold the lid on, just these pads, and you can pop off the lid to reveal the expansion slots. A wide range of first and third-party devices would be released, from modems to hard disk controllers, and these examples which I have on the table. We've got a print buffer here, a language card which included an auto start ROM to boot from disk drive and an extra 16K of RAM. It first shipped with programming language Pascal. This interesting looking dual card is a sound card which offered 8 stereo voices of 8-bit audio, with a light pen to plot notes on the screen as you compose tunes. Now that sounds like a whole other episode in itself, so we won't get tied up in that just yet, but it's an interesting card. And this, a disk drive interface, which we hope will make our 2 disk drives usable. Also available was an 80-column display card, and it would become commonplace to use this and custom lowercase fonts to work around those limitations where possible. This would have involved adding a wire from your shift key to the socket where you'd plug your paddle controllers, and programs designed to detect that would switch out the custom font to show a change in case. Hacky, yes, but this was the very first generation of home micros. We were still working out what to do with them, and within the limitations of the hardware. These were exciting times. It was a seriously impressive package for 1977, and it's no wonder that it launched the careers of many people we've spoken to in the past on the channel. Richard Garriott, Ken and Roberta Williams, Brenda Romero all sing the praises of the Apple II. But where does the Apple IIe fit into all of this? Let's find out. The original Apple II would be discontinued in 1981, replaced by the Apple II Plus. That model included a Microsoft version of the basic programming language named AppleSoft Basic. The key feature of this being that floating point calculations were now supported in it, albeit with a speed hit to crunch those numbers. A choice of 16, 32 or 48K of RAM was offered with the Plus model, but the falling price of memory meant that the Plus machines would ship with 48K of RAM as standard after the first year of launch. The Plus also had auto start ROMs as standard, meaning it would try and boot from a floppy disk as soon as you turned it on, as many Apple II owners now opted for the floppy drive option. So we had the Apple II, we had the Apple II Plus, and that should not be confused with the Apple II Euro Plus. That was a version of the original Apple II with a modified power supply and video output, specifically for the European market, and there was also the J Plus, which offered the same to the Japanese market. No, our Apple IIe was the third official Apple II model in the range, and the E stands for Enhanced. Released in 1983, the IIe offered lots more over those earlier models.
The same old 2, but implemented with 1983 technology.
A cost reduction exercise saw Apple reduce the chip count and use newer chips where they could. Upper and lowercase characters were finally supported out of the box. No hacking paddles needed here.
Caps lock, and a host of other additions, giving the keyboard a full 128 ASCII upper lowercase character set with 63 keys.
And an 80-column display mode was now included as standard. Continued memory price drops now meant that it included 64K of RAM as standard, with some of that additional RAM located on the 80-column card, effectively doubling the available video memory to accommodate that extra display mode. You could also have an extended 80-column card, which would take the machine up to 128K of RAM. On the front of the Apple IIe is something unusual you may have noticed, a switch. This was not a user modification, it came from the factory like this, and this would switch the character set between our local set, for example one that includes the UK currency pound symbol, and the US ASCII character set. The Apple IIe would cement its place as the most popular Apple II, selling more than any other model in the Apple II range, and remaining available to purchase all the way through to 1993, and it's easy to see why. This evolution of the Apple, with its 80-column mode, its affordable disk drive interface, plenty of memory and expansion capabilities, and the availability of killer apps such as Spreadsheet VisiCalc, or perhaps you used competing product Microsoft Multiplan, made this such a popular choice amongst both business and home users.
But you know, the IIe is better than the 2. And my hat's off to the IIe team. It's better than Woz and I did in 1976.
So here in the UK, the Apple IIs weren't massively popular. We certainly respected them for their capabilities and for their build quality, but there weren't many of them about in my experience, my own personal experience. There was nobody on my estate that had one. It was all Commodores, Spectrums, Amstrad CPCs, all of those were the 8-bit machines of choice. A lot of homegrown machines where the price point was so much lower to get into computing compared to the Apple II. I did have an uncle who had one, and it just so happened that he worked for an American company, so he was coming back and forward and he brought an Apple II back with him. And that is when I first experienced an Apple, and the Oregon Trail is the program that you showed me on there.
Did you die of dysentery?
Of course I did. When was the first time you saw an Apple II, Mark?
That's a question. What day is it now?
It's Wednesday.
Wednesday then.
Really? Is this honestly the first one that you've
Honest
seen and
to goodness, this is the first time I've ever seen an Apple II machine.
Okay. And
EGS, whatever variant you want to say, the first time.
Yeah. So you've been getting to know it as we try and figure out what's wrong with it. What's your first impressions of the hardware then?
It's very simple. It's obviously manufactured to a price point, but it's not cutting any corners.
There's certainly a lot of things are socketed in there, which
Yes.
is nice. You know, that's not cost cutting. That makes things very easy to test and upgrade. Yeah. Anyway, enough chat. I want to see if we can get this thing working. So Mark, why don't you take us through the repair process and what you find, and if indeed you can get this working.
Okay. So the first thing that I noticed was when we powered it on, that there was no red power LED lit up on the board in here, which you can see there. But that led me to have a look at the power supply, and there's absolutely no voltage coming from here. And it's a power supply that gives us 5 volts, 12 volts, and -5 and -12 volts. But again, absolutely nothing coming through. Reading up on some forums, there's some common issues with these plugs. The connectors can splag and not make contact with the board, but that's not the case here, unfortunately, and reading directly off the pins, no voltage. So first port of call is to take apart and see what's going on inside the power supply, because if there's no power coming out of this, then there's no power going into our Apple II.
Looking inside, this is a fairly typical PSU from the time period, and similar to the kind of quality power supplies that Aztec produce for other companies. Without removing the wiring to the IEC power socket, it's not possible to decouple the board from the case completely, so we'll work with it in situ. Looking at the other side of the power input, we can see a nasty little reefer cap lurking. This one is a suppression capacitor and will be replaced before the magic smoke is released. On the PSU board itself, we can see yet another reefer cap on the AC input side of the circuit. Whilst this hasn't blown yet, it will, and needs to be swapped out for a new part. We'll be replacing this with a modern cap of the same brand, although it's now manufactured by another company and is much more reliable. Other brands and indeed sizes are available though, as shown by the board having 2 mounting pitches. But as it stands, we'll use the updated reefer caps, and we'll be using a direct match. The old cap is much more resistive and takes a lot longer to charge than the new part does. Firing up the soldering iron, we get down to business. These capacitors are not polarised and can be inserted in any orientation. I'll just match to the screen print on the board for this one. Like the original manufacturer, we use 60/40 leaded solder. We want to avoid any potential mixing or contamination of the alloys, causing cracks to form later on in service. But that one capacitor is not the whole story, and we also changed the input cap on the socket, followed by removing all of these ancient electrolytics. Not one of these has leaked, a testament perhaps to the manufacturer, but they really are past their prime. We replaced them one by one, an arduous but necessary task. It's quite amazing just how much smaller new capacitors are compared to their period counterparts. We used quality branded capacitors rated to 105 degrees centigrade for our replacements. But were the old capacitors actually fine after all? Well, why don't we test them for the record? This is a 1000 microfarad capacitor. The ESR is not high as you might usually see on a failed capacitor, but the capacitance is a whopping 1626 microfarads, wildly out of spec. This is a 330 microfarad capacitor. Again, the ESR is okay, but the capacitance is far too high at 445 microfarads. Even with tolerances, it shouldn't be more than about 365 microfarads really. Even the larger caps from the high voltage side of the PSU are totally out of the manufacturer's plus or minus 10% specification. And finally, a test of a 680 microfarad cap proves that the old caps simply had to go.
So Mark's worked his magic on the PSU. Fingers crossed that this is going to work. I've been looking at the expansion cards, so I'm going to pop them in. But I did notice there's a difference on the machine and the cards. On this Disk 2 interface card, for example, it says Made in Ireland on the one in the 2E, whereas an older card that I've got here from 1978 says Made in the USA. So Apple moving some of their manufacturing functions over to Ireland, or expanding rather than moving, to cater to the European market. Let's pop these back in here, and I've also noticed the back plane is different. They've made some changes to make it easier to connect devices up. So we want to connect the disk drive up. I believe the blue one was at the bottom when I took this out. Got the luxury of 2 floppy drives on this machine. There we go, that's connected up. We'll plug that in. Next up, we've got our 80-column expansion card /64K, and it very helpfully says keyboard end, so I know which way to install it. And it goes in the auxiliary connector here rather than one of the other regular expansion slots. Push that in, there we go, that's in. The final card that was in this when it arrived was a serial interface card. Now, I don't think I have a use for a serial port at this stage. It's very easy to open the lid and install things, so I'm not going to bother with this at this time. I'm going to leave it out, pop the lid on, just double check actually, make sure things are in the right way round. I think they are, the power supply's plugged in. Good. And I think we're good to go. Let's just show you the difference in the backplane because it's quite a substantial difference. We've got an Apple II Euro Plus over here, which, as we learned in our history lesson, is effectively the same as an original Apple II with a power supply and video output adapted for our market. Here's our very dirty 2E. We will get it cleaned up, I promise. But just look at that. This is the new backplane, nicely numbered ports. You can see where you're expected to screw them in and have the ports exposed, like this one here, and you can just slot things in. Although, in the case of the disk drives, they sort of neatly go into the holes. They're not, you have to go into the case to disconnect them. Whereas over here, we've got slots, but only 3, as opposed to the 8 expansion slots in there. So obviously many are expected to be internal expansions, and you've got gaps for 3 external ones. It's all a little bit odd. I don't quite know how that works. This is much more understandable and well thought through. But there we go, that's the evolution between the two machines. Let's get this one out of the way. In case you were wondering, this one is in good working order, no work needed here. If we're going to test this, we're going to need a display, of course. So I've grabbed this Mitsubishi CRT here, which we'll plug in just with the composite input from here. Now I do have the original monitor that was used by Philip on this. And let me just show you, because it's a lovely looking thing. It's Karga branded monitor, and it sits there. And as I so often see in the adverts for this, they display it with the Apple, with the disk drives on top, and then the monitor on top of that. And when you've got a monitor of this size, this must be, what, a 12-inch monitor? It does work. It does look very nice indeed. Let's see if we've got a model. Yeah, 12-inch green monitor is what this one is. KG12NBN is the model number, in case you were wondering. It's absolutely filthy. Doesn't turn on. It's yellowed. But that's not to say we're not going to have a go at saving this. Just not in today's episode. We've got a whole series in which to look at all these things. But it would be a really nice finishing touch if we can get this cleaned up and working. Let's pop that out the way for now. Now, to put the Mitsubishi on top, that's a 14-inch CRT, so it would just look ridiculous. So we're not going to do that. Let me find the cables we need to connect this up. I'm excited. Is it going to work? Unfortunately, my flap a little bit snapped off, so it won't close. But that's not important right now. Okay, the moment of truth. I'm going to hit the power switch on the back of our Apple II. Cross your fingers, everyone. Before I do, I should probably make sure there's no discs in the drive, just in case. There we go. Nothing. Have I done something stupid here? Have I done something wrong? We got a picture. Okay. A little wiggle of the 80 column card there. So I'm guessing we've maybe got a dirty connector. The whole board needs to come out and be given a good clean, and don't worry, that will happen. But right now I'm not going to touch anything else. It's on. I can hear a spinning disk drive. Okay. Now, being unfamiliar with the Apple II as I am, it looks like nothing happens until we boot from something. Let me figure this out. Hang on, guys. I'm reading the manual. Someone has to. As we learned in the history lesson, and I should have been paying attention, there was that extra ROM which would allow the Apple II to boot automatically from floppy disk. And that was on an expansion card, and then in the E it was integrated into the E, so it's right there and the disk is spinning, so I think all I need to do is put a disk in. So what better place to start than Apple presents Apple, an introduction to the Apple IIe computer. Let's see if this works. I would be really surprised if these disk drives are still working, to be honest. I've got a message. Must boot from slot 6. So I think perhaps we've put our floppy disk card in the wrong slot. I'm sure we have plenty of American friends watching on and laughing at both mine and Mark's inexperience with the Apple II. Such is a reflection of our experiences here. And I think, I'm ready to be corrected in the comments, but I think as a whole in the UK, we weren't greatly exposed to them. But there will be some ardent British Apple fans, I'm sure, standing ready to correct me. Okay, we are very definitely in slot number 6 now. Let's see how we get on with that. I can hear that disk drive whirring away. Let me just hold my mic up. Away! I'm so surprised that that disk drive has actually worked. So it's working. What you'll notice is there's this kind of weird shimmer. It's almost like you've got reds, you've got greens, you've got blues shimmering across. And this should just be a black and white screen at the moment. So that tells us something about the way the video signal is being processed. We talked earlier about the NTSC signal and how they managed to fudge color out of it. And what these artifacts are, I don't think are intentional, and I don't think you would see them if we had a green screen or a monochrome screen. It's just the fact that it's going through this television. But that's something to explore when we get a proper screen working. And here is the color test screen, and it says, do the words above appear in several different colors? And the shimmer shimmers more when the disk's being accessed. It's quite unusual. And Well, yes, technically I do see them in colour, but violet isn't violet, orange isn't orange, blue isn't blue. I guess the butterfly is kind of yellow, green isn't green. So no, I don't see them in colour really. It says you probably don't have a colour television or monitor then. If you know where the controls are, you may wish to adjust the contrast and brightness. We've got a lot to learn about this, haven't we? And learn we did with another read of the manual, because while the original Apple II didn't give us colour in PAL, the Euro Plus did have the option of a colour expansion card, and that was then made standard on board on the IIe. Why don't we have colour then? Because of this switch. The previous owner had a monochrome monitor, and so it had been set to mono. So I flicked it over, and colour. And I adjusted R63 and 64 to get those colours looking just right. And now we have a colour Apple IIe, perfect. John Williams, eat your heart out. The colour palette I describe as being quite pastel. You can see it well in the Ghost in Snapper, as well as the title screen to Star Thief here, and a host of other games which I got to enjoy. I think we really need to draw things to a close there, because I was getting far too carried away, exploring all these discs, playing games, learning about the Apple II, and as my first experience with the Apple II as a grown man, because I was a kid when I first tried an Apple II out back in the day, it's a really enjoyable one. I can see the appeal of it. I understand why it was so popular. And this was 1983. An Apple II in 1977 would have been just absolutely mesmerizing and mind-blowing, and I get it. I get why it was so popular. I'm astounded that the disk drive works. Floppy drive too also works, but it makes a hell of a racket. So that's the first thing on our list. We're going to service these drives in part 2. We've proven that the PSU repair worked, so that's great. I've noticed something else. The keyboard here, the Apple IIe keyboard here with 63 keys, it's very different to the very brown and 70s looking keyboard of the original Apple II with 10 keys less. Changes on the IIe include the reset key has been moved, so you don't accidentally press that. We've had 4 cursor keys added down at the bottom right hand corner. Oddly, they're all in a line, but they're there. And either side of the spacebar, we've got the solid and the open Apple keys added. And apparently, if you hold the solid Apple key, control and reset, it will perform a 20-second hardware diagnostic test. I think we should absolutely do that right now. And it passed with flying colours, so we can see that we've got a happy Apple. Huge amount to cover in part 2. I hope you'll join us for it. I want to see us out by reading an article here from the New York Times in January 25th, 1983, just to give us a little bit more of an insight into how people felt about the machine when it came out back then. Will it sell, and should you as a consumer consider buying one? The answer to both is a definitive maybe. Although it may sound surprising, Apple Computers has never really been a technological leader. As the famous dynamic Apple duo of Steve Jobs and Stephen Wozniak were inventing the personal computer in a garage, a number of other personal computers were already out in the real world. What Apple did invent was a marketing plan that converted the microcomputer from an elegant technological toy into a small businessman's leading-edge tool and launched computers into a sea of mass merchandise. The Apple IIe falls into the same marketing strategy. It is essentially a catch-up machine, and I think that's a fair assessment. It certainly wasn't cutting edge in 1983, it was in 1977, but there was plenty of life in the old dog yet, and we'll learn lots more about that in the next part of this series. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care everyone. we can immediately see that it's absolutely filthy. And of course, you should wash your fruit before you use it.
It sounded so bad when you said it back.